Hello and welcome to the next 45 minutes to an hour. It's a program which I must say I am really looking forward to, and I have to admit, and I've admitted to many in the newsroom, that I have admired Shyam Saran for many, many years. In fact, I totally agree with what Robert Blackwell, a former US ambassador to India, said about Shyam Saran. He said he's arguably the most brilliant Indian diplomat in the past 4 decades. Now this is a new book that Shyam Saran's just written. It's called How India Sees the World. It is absolutely fascinating. I honestly think you should read it. It is written very simply, beautifully written, with complex concepts made easily accessible, I found. I would have added something to the title. I would have liked to have said it's not only about India sees the world. I found it's a lot about how the world sees India, in fact. And that is as fascinating because how India has changed over time and how the world's perception of India has changed as India gets stronger economically. And perhaps as important, how the world's perception of India changes with the emergence of China and how China's huge success in its growth and power is impacting India's international relations. That is an underlying theme in the book which I found fascinating. I must start right away with China, and the question I think that comes to mind from your book and your art, and if you relate it to what's happening now, China is India's major challenge. That's the kind of thrust of your a lot of the work on China.
And it remains a challenge.
It remains a challenge, yeah. And to just bring it a little bit, if you can use the book's context in Doklam and what happened there. Why did Doklam happen at all?
I can only give you my own perspective.
Right.
I think that China, saw this as a low-risk, low-cost move to nudge Bhutan into accepting what has been a very long-standing offer on settling the border issue, which very importantly would have meant that Doklam, that is under dispute, would have gone to China. Secondly, to also nudge Bhutan into establishing diplomatic relations, exchange of embassies,
which they've been resisting.
They have been resisting for quite some time. And in the bargain, some collateral benefit of putting some additional pressure on India as well. And China, in a sense, follows a certain playbook. A playbook which every single move that it makes may not be important enough or threatening enough to invite a strong counter-reaction.
Just an incremental
advances, but those advances cumulatively begin to change the facts on the ground.
When you do 10 incremental changes,
exactly. And then how do you reverse that?
It's tough to reverse.
It becomes much more difficult to reverse.
That's what the book kind of brings out, the incremental approach.
Yes. And a good demonstration of that, Pranay, is what has happened in the South China Sea.
Exactly.
Where you have had a series of these kind of incremental moves, none of which was serious enough to invite a strong reaction, whether from the US or whether from the Southeast Asian countries involved. And yet we have now ended up in a situation where really Chinese dominance of that region has become, in a sense, irreversible.
It's fascinating, this incremental small moves, which they have actually a 5-year, 10-year plan, but they don't get they get to their objective very incrementally.
Yes. And the dilemma for those who have to deal with this is at what point of time do you confront this? So Doklam, in that sense, came as a surprise to them that in fact there was a reaction to it.
So how was it diffused, you feel?
So I think we have to recognize that the very limited objective which Bhutan and India would have had, which is really the restoration of the status quo, that has been achieved, at least for the time being it has been achieved.
But of course the Chinese are saying different spin.
Yes, certainly. That is why
what you're saying is that actually India's objectives have been
the
met.
Limited objective. So we must not make too much of it, but the limited objective of establishing status quo again has been achieved. And I think it was perhaps driven by the need for China and particularly Xi Jinping to ensure the success of the BRICS summit, in which China has invested quite a great deal, and to make certain that with respect to the forthcoming Party Congress, which is going to take place in October very soon, that there would be no sort of discordant element going towards that important meeting. So I think it was very much related to
So
that.
maybe the timing was not that good, and the surprise was that India actually reacted.
Well, yes, I think
Then one
the timing
incremental
was not good because they did not
The
anticipate
reaction.
that there would be this
So
reaction.
they thought it was incremental enough for India to ignore, but it was a good move to
In a sense, yes, in retrospect.
But can we just say, what about the future now?
So, the BRICS summit has just concluded. The Prime Minister is on his way to Myanmar for an official visit. Now, what has emerged from the meeting between, very important meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, is that they have agreed that they would try to strengthen the mechanisms through which they can deal with issues such as Doklam. And that is a very encouraging outcome. That the two sides have agreed that they will strengthen their confidence building measures in this respect. So hopefully going forward, maybe if the Indian side and the Chinese side handle this relationship appropriately, then perhaps maybe such kind of incidents will be avoided.
But given the
future.
history, can we sit back and react? I mean,
no, we should never sit back and relax.
I mean,
think.
can we say, okay, now it's under control?
No, I think we should be relieved that what could be potentially a crisis which could have escalated has not, and that we have been able to bring the relationship with China back to some kind of an even keel, and that is an important step forward.
Just tell me, in the larger China-India border dispute, which is a legacy for decades, especially what are the lessons from the 1962 war and Doklam and what's going to come in the future?
Well, it's interesting that you should mention this because, in the recent past, quite a lot of new archival material has become available.
You have dug up a lot of new material on the 1962 war.
Yes. So
I found that fascinating.
One of the very important things which has come out is that at least until 1958, there was not much dispute about the alignment of the border in the eastern sector, the so-called McMahon line. The Chinese were not happy with it, but they had conveyed quite clearly that even though they are not happy, for friendly relations between the two countries, they are willing to accept this alignment.
In the eastern sector, that was Arunachal and all.
That's right. So there was no reference to the western sector because in the early 50s, the western sector had not emerged as a issue of difference
By the western sector you mean
the Aksai Chin area. Exactly. Now in 1958 what happened was that for the first time when the existence of the road through Aksai Chin became known to the Indian side actually put in a démarche with the Chinese side, in fact laying claim to Aksai Chin and saying that this road has been illegally built through Indian territory. When that happened, and Chinese sources make this explicitly clear.
And you've got that in the book actually.
Yes, and they linked the two things together. So what would not have been...
meaning the eastern side with
the western
side which they had accepted.
Right.
Suddenly they said, well, I'm not sure about that.
we will perhaps keep our claim alive in the eastern sector because it is going to be an important bargaining chip for asserting our claim in the western sector.
And why did they really want that road in
Because at that particular point of time, the communication links between mainland China and Tibet were very, very weak. Most of the easier access to Tibet was in fact from the Indian side. So this road at that particular point of time was very, very important and critical for them. So that is why they laid such a lot of stress on why this had to be kept with China, and that is how the so-called package proposal came in. You keep what you have in the east, and we will keep what we have in the west. Which of course, as you know, we did not accept even after 1962.
Right. So then the war happened, and then a lot of post-facto analysis hasn't seen this point about the change that took place in 1958.
Well, as I said, even though there may have been a general awareness of these issues, but it has not been explicitly as clear as it has now become available through the archival material which has become
this trade-off and
exactly.
You learn a lot about Chinese strategy and diplomacy from that.
Exactly.
What about India strategy and diplomacy? I mean, many people say, does India have a global strategy, number one? Was it just a legacy of the British Raj? Is that what you are?
Well, I think this is very unfortunate that even a lot of Indian commentators seem to accept that there was no India before the British.
By the way, I'm quoting others. I don't agree with it, but I wanted to know that's a criticism.
Yes, but I think, especially while researching for this book, it has been very clear to me that the idea of India is actually a very ancient idea. The sense that there is a identifiable geographical space.
The idea of India.
Exactly.
Which many people say there's no such thing.
Well, I think they are wrong. So there has been a very, very continuing kind of sense amongst Indians that they belong to something called India, which has a recognizable geographical space, which is also constitutes a shared cultural space.
And it's not just the British that did it.
No. No. So many people, for example, do not realize that the first centralized empire, which covers most of what we call India today, actually dates back to the Mauryan Empire, which is 323 BC. China did not have a centralized empire until more than 100 years later. So in that sense,
the idea of India dates back to even before China.
Exactly. And mind you, I mean, there has been a certain continuity. So you had the Mauryan Empire, you had the Gupta Empire, you had the Mughal Empire, and yes, you had the British Empire as well. But what I'm saying is that the idea of India is much older than what people think it is. And therefore, the tradition of statecraft, which many people feel is only a legacy of that British period, actually we forget that there is a much more ancient tradition of statecraft in India, which we should be conscious of. And in many ways, that particular legacy DNA also impacts on how we relate to the world today. That
you mentioned Chanakya and many others.
Exactly. And what is remarkable is that many of the elements which you find in Chanakyan statecraft is actually very relevant today. I don't want to make a mechanical kind of template in this respect, but the fact is that
it's useful, it's part of our DNA.
Very useful.
If I had to ask you, and you do kind of answer it in the book, which nations will succeed now in this globalized world? What kind of nations?
Well, number one, globalization is here to stay.
Yes.
And therefore, successful societies of the future, to my mind, are those which can actually deal with a globalized world. What is so special about the globalized world? That we are much more interconnected, we are engaging much more with each other than ever before. So which are the countries which can be successful in that new environment? It is precisely countries which can handle plurality, which can handle diversity, which have a certain cosmopolitan spirit. And if you look at India's history, it is a classic crossroads culture. It has been at the intersecting point of ancient maritime routes, it has been at the intersecting point of ancient caravan routes, to Central Asia, for example. So if you take this sustained history of being a crossroads culture.
One crossroads, and you also said the diversity and the plurality of our society.
I mean, that is actually a great strength that India has, and an attribute which is particularly important, particularly precious in terms of dealing with a globalized world.
Right.
And I think it is very important first to understand that history of being a crossroads culture, and how it is one of the most important assets that we have in terms of dealing with a more globalized world.
Right. But you say that the world has become more globalized, there's so many changes, yet do we and have we had any continuity or any consistency in our foreign policy?
Well, again, one of the things that became apparent to me while writing this book and looking at different phases of India's modern history is precisely how consistent India's foreign policy has been, how much of continuity there is in the manner in which we have related to the world. May have been expressed in terms of, say, non-alignment during the early years. Maybe we call it multi-alignment today, or having a much more diversified relationship with the rest of the world. But essentially, what has been a driver of India's foreign policy is the search for strategic, what I call strategic autonomy.
Right.
What does that mean? It means, is India able to take relatively autonomous decisions on issues which are of vital interest to it? That's means
key, actually.
Yes. It is not that all issues are of vital interest. So you have to pick and choose, and that is where strategy comes in.
Now I want to pick and choose one which there's been a lot of criticism about. We have lost our autonomy and our decision-making power in many areas. It's about the nuclear deal. My question is really, reading it, of course, you're so deeply involved in it and reading about it, it's fascinating. Was it a game changer? Or was it much ado about nothing? A lot of marketing in the sense that...
As somebody who spent, sleepless
exactly
nights, trying to...
So is it much ado about nothing?
No,
because we didn't even have one nuclear plant come
without exaggerating... Sorry.
Before you go into whether it's the game changer or not, how did it happen suddenly? What changed in the world? What made the deal possible? Was it the emergence of China, as you suggested?
There is no doubt that the emergence of China was a very important factor. Perhaps not the only factor, but certainly. Well, the United States of America, India began to see a strong convergence of interests because of the emerging challenge of China and the recognition that this is going to be an enduring challenge in the future.
Right.
So there is a certain long-term convergence of interest in how to manage, how to deal with this emerging challenge.
Oh, so that was a key
very important factor, a change in the American perception
of the challenge of China.
Exactly.
So better tie up with India.
Of course, there were other things as well.
Right.
I mean, the emergence of India as an IT power, as a knowledge power, looking at the economic opportunities that India presented post-liberalization. So there were other factors, but this was a very important factor.
But one thing you do write in the book, and if you could explain that a little more, you say if India is to be a partner, it must stop being a target.
Yes. So what we put across to the United States is that yes, we recognize that we have this strong convergence and a long-term convergence. Yes, there is need for us to work together to our mutual benefit. But in order to have that kind of long-term partnership, we cannot also be treated as a target at the same time, which is what was happening in terms of the technology denial regimes which were targeting India after first the 1974 nuclear test, and then certainly strengthened much more after
So first they were just preventing us getting nuclear.
Exactly.
Then any technology
kept on expanding to include a whole series of dual-use technologies. Anything to do remotely with nuclear was also put in the same basket.
Right.
So we
and then it was getting worse and worse as time went on.
So we ended up by having almost like a wall around us.
And many other countries followed the American...
Exactly. So I think one of the very important takeaways from this nuclear deal was that because the nuclear was the key, in a sense, once that key was turned, a lot of these technology denial regimes fell by the wayside.
So when we say did we gain anything at all, so you're saying the first thing is because we didn't even get one new nuclear plant, as I mentioned.
That is the criticism.
But there were other major advantages. What were they?
So, with respect to the nuclear sector itself, don't forget that at the time when we were negotiating the nuclear deal, one of the main problems that we were facing was the shortage of nuclear fuel. because of these restrictions that I mentioned, our access to the international market for nuclear fuel was very, very limited.
Right.
In fact, there was a danger of Tarapur even
shutting
closing down. So one of the things which the nuclear deal has done is that today we have a series of long-term fuel supply agreements with a number of countries in the world. There is Russia, there is Uzbekistan, there is Mongolia, and also Australia, who are actually competing to sell uranium to India. So the nuclear fuel constraint is no longer an issue.
It was a major. So while we may not have had new plants, at least our old plants can be.
Yes, they can be,
function.
and we can look forward to the expansion of the nuclear energy sector without being worried about the fuel constraint.
Yes.
That is a very important thing.
Okay.
Second is, as I mentioned, the technology reliant regimes which have been mostly dismantled, and they have played a very important role in the upgrading of the technology of Indian industry, of our defense industry. You know, the kind of very important cooperation deals that we have with the United States in the defense sector, including the purchase of very high-tech equipment and weaponry, would not have been possible.
And not only
this.
defense, even our whole tech sector was being affected, right?
Exactly. And the third important thing is that because the United States of America was seen as making a major departure in its foreign policy for the benefit of India, this had also a very important impact on the attitudes of both its allies as well as adversaries. So India's diplomatic space, in a sense, quite significantly is expanded, and that was a major gain for us. So even though as of now we have not been able to establish a new nuclear plant, many of them are in the pipeline. Maybe nothing has been constructed so far. We have been impacted, as you said, because of Fukushima. And its impact on public.
And the whole world has changed their views a bit about it, and maybe it's not a bad thing that but everything else has meant that nuclear deal was a game changer in terms of the technology.
I have no hesitation in saying that this was, I think, one of the most important breakthroughs that India was able to.
What about losing our autonomy in decision making? For example, and it's slightly misunderstood, and you'll clarify how our plants can be checked and monitored and people can visit it?
Well, I think it is perhaps not well understood that the inspection regime applies only to those reactors which we have already identified as being civil. They do not apply, and they are not expected to apply to those facilities, those reactors which are clearly in the strategic sector.
Defense or anything strategic.
Yes. Yeah.
And we've clarified, so nobody can go to those?
No.
How did they agree to that? Because they don't normally agree.
Well, because both agreed that this particular deal was about civil nuclear commerce. It was not about India's strategic program.
I can see you arguing this at the table. That didn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
So you feel the autonomy of decision making was not impacted?
Was not impacted, and I know that some controversy had arisen about the some of the clauses in the Hyde Act, which allowed the United States to negotiate this nuclear deal, or in the 123 agreement itself, which actually set out the terms and conditions for cooperation. But what I would like to say is that there were three very important and permanent waivers which were given by this legislation. One was that the United States of America will be able to cooperate with India even though India does not have all its nuclear facilities under international safeguards. We just discussed that there was our strategic sector was out of bounds.
Yes.
Secondly, that the United States of America could not cooperate with a country which had actually exploded a nuclear device.
Had done a test.
Which India had done.
Yes.
Okay. Third was, very importantly, that the United States of America will not be able to cooperate with a country which is engaged in the production of nuclear explosive devices, which India was. So these are three important, these are three important waivers that we got on a permanent basis.
Now, frankly, these are huge waivers.
Exactly.
And people must have wondered, how did America do this?
Well, this is the irony that many outside India said, how did you get this from the United States? But of course, in India, as you know, we also got a lot of brickbats.
So it's India, you'll always get, we are the most critical of ourselves. Yeah. But in terms of getting these waivers, Is it just because they were China was such a challenge that they really wanted to partner with India?
Well,
and was that the beginning of India and America becoming closer as partners? Not against China, but at least as a protection.
I think is very, as we started, this particular conversation, that China was certainly a very important factor. But I would not like to say that China was the only factor. As I said, I mean, India also represented an opportunity. Because of the economic reforms and liberalization.
But that wouldn't have been enough.
There is also the very strong link provided by the Indian diaspora in the United States of America. So there were other factors.
But frankly, those had been in existence and they were still.
Well, perhaps did not become as salient as they did.
Maybe
during
the
this,
4% growth rate going to 7-8%.
Yes, that did change the perception of India. Yeah. But I think no doubt. That China was an important factor, not so much in terms of both trying to contain China, but how to manage, the challenge of China.
Exactly.
Both as an opportunity, but also a possible potential threat.
Yes, yes. Now, many just takes me on from the nuclear deal to many environmentalists have criticized nuclear energy, and the world's view has changed, and India has played a very important role on global climate change. So if we look at global climate change, as you write in the book, what is India's role in the world? If you can just explain in some detail, because again you are quite deeply involved, from Copenhagen to Paris. That's 6 years.
Yes.
How have things changed?
Well, two things. One is that, with respect to climate change, our position had been very much in line with what was the 1992 historic convention on climate change, if you remember, the Rio Convention.
Right.
That climate change is taking place not because of current emissions of greenhouse gases, but because of the accumulated stock of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. Right. And who's responsible for most of that accumulation? It is mainly the industrialized countries. So our point was that in any kind of equitable regime that we need to construct in order to deal with this challenge, there has to be a awareness of the responsibility of those who are responsible for that.
Recognition of your past crimes has to be recognized.
Now what has happened is that essentially we have moved away from that stand to one which is basically focused on current emissions.
Right. But in Copenhagen, what exactly happened?
Well, in Copenhagen, we were unable to reach any kind of a climate change treaty or agreement.
Who were the main players? Was India one of them?
This is where, when we came to a deadlock, the accord which finally came out was with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Premier Wen Jiabao of China, President Zuma of South Africa, and President Lula of Brazil sitting on one side, and then Obama sitting on the other side.
I see. He kind of walked in and sat on the other side of the table.
So how do we save, the Copenhagen summit? And the deal which was worked out, which became known as Copenhagen Accord, was really something which emerged out of that meeting amongst these four very large emerging economies and the United States of America on the other. And people actually reacted to this by saying, this is a changed world order. Where you have these emerging countries playing such a great key role.
Together.
Exactly.
And then in Paris?
And then in Paris, 6 years later, it is not the emerging countries, basic countries who are actually in the lead in terms of the fashioning an agreement, but what was agreed upon between President Xi Jinping of China and President Obama of the United States.
So the Paris
what they agreed
just
upon,
two of them.
Yes, what they agreed upon then became the template for the Paris Agreement. So this represents the kind of change that has taken place, where China,
huge change,
in seeing its interests better served by working together with other major economies, in this case saw its interests better served by equating itself, by benchmarking itself with the United States of America. That's an important change.
Very, very important. And what's the key difference between India and the United States that still remains?
Well, there are a number of issues that remain.
But the key
Of course, the climate change, as you know, President Trump has walked out of the Paris Agreement, and
that makes me feel that the climate change is absolutely the right thing to do.
and perhaps that is the reason why India has said, even if the United States walks out, we will remain committed to it. And I think that's the...
But we are ready to be committed to an agreement made between China and the US.
Yes, well, if, as the basic framework. I think the saving grace is that much of what will actually go into a future climate change regime is being elaborated, in fact, through subsequent multilateral
they give the framework and all the details are now being done. And India is participating in
that. Very actively. And I think it would be very important for India to ensure that whatever ultimately emerges from these negotiations at least safeguards India's developmental prospects.
And that's the key difference between America and India. Can India actually in this whole process again take a lead on climate change, you think?
Two aspects. You know, there is a domestic aspect to climate change and then there is the international aspect.
Yes.
As far as the domestic aspect is concerned, I have no doubt in my mind that the long-term interest of India lies in making a strategic shift from its current reliance on fossil fuel-based growth to a pattern of economic growth and activity which is increasingly, progressively based more on renewable sources of energy and cleaner sources of energy, such as nuclear energy we spoke about.
Or solar.
So solar as a renewable energy source. I think India has begun to make that shift because we have invested very heavily, for example, in solar energy. India has promoted the International Solar Alliance. India's energy efficiency has improved dramatically over the last few years.
Energy efficiency?
In the terms of energy intensity of growth. That is, what is the amount of energy that you need to use for an additional dollar of GDP?
Right.
That intensity has been coming down over a period of time. That means we are becoming more energy efficient, which is very important in terms of dealing with climate change.
We're not projecting this.
So this is the problem, that while we need to do much more, I acknowledge, but I think we have done quite a bit compared to certainly many others, which we are not taking full credit for. To give you an example, we are one of the few countries which have imposed a cess on coal. It is today 400 rupees per ton.
Right.
And that is becoming the source of funds for clean energy development.
Right.
Now we should take credit for that. Yes. Or the plans that we have for the expansion of solar energy. We should take credit for that.
Of course, we just have to walk outside on the streets and we have a long way to go.
Well, yes, I mean, we are facing an ecological crisis, and an ecological crisis of which climate change is very much a part, and that is probably going to impact on countries like India much more than perhaps on other countries. But I think it would be short-sighted for countries in the West, for example, to think, oh, we will be less affected than the tropical countries, and therefore we need not make as much sacrifice or as much contribution to this. We are an interconnected planet.
Anything that happens here affects them, anything that will affect us. Yes.
So given the fact that this planet is such a fragile planet and it is such an interconnected planet, I think it would be very short-sighted to actually think in terms of some short-term benefits here and there. Yes.
So I meant in addition to all the pollution and the toxic atmosphere we have around us, we are also chopping down our forests, wildlife is being destroyed. Is there anything in our history, like you talked about, there is a history that helps us with our statecraft and our diplomacy. Is there anything in our history, in our culture, that matters, that we can use to protect our trees and our environment?
Well, we are today living in an India where there is a lot of emphasis being placed on the revival of Indian culture, revival of Indian traditions. Perhaps one tradition which really needs revival on a very urgent basis is in fact the tradition that we have of looking at nature as a source of nurture, looking at nature as mother, not as in the West, a force to be harnessed and conquered for serving the greed of man. So are we in a position to return to that kind of a value system which looks at nature as a source of nurture, from which you should not extract more than its ability to regenerate. After all, that is the principle of economic, environmental
So it's in our
sustainability.
history, in our culture,
Exactly.
but we are bringing out all the wrong things.
Precisely.
These are the things
So
instead of
I
focusing
think
on.
those who are talking about, revival of Indian culture, this is perhaps the most important element in Indian culture which needs revival.
I hate to give a silly example, but in Calcutta in particular, people used to urinate a lot on the walls. And the way they stopped it is by putting gods and goddesses on the walls, and nobody does it.
Well, unfortunately,
so whatever
there seems
works,
to be,
so our trees and our
yes,
our goddesses and
you have trees being looked upon as goddesses, as you
and that should be highlighted and revived.
Yeah.
And then
Because I think we really need to restore the respect for nature. Without that restoration of respect for nature, environmental sustainability, safeguarding what is a very fragile ecology that our planet represents would be very, very difficult.
And I do want to, there are many other topics which we shall get into, but one major one I want to just cover in some detail is the India-Pakistan whole relationship. With India and Pakistan, will our relationship ever be normal? In the sense that just quickly, the BRICS reference to terrorism in Pakistan that just happened. Is Pakistan going to take that seriously?
No, I do not think so, because Pakistan continues to regard these groups, particularly those which are India-centered, as assets, strategic assets. And today, even though there may be pressure, they are convinced that their very strong relationship with China will in fact shield them from international pressure.
But the interesting part that this was at BRICS and China was there
Agreed.
and they agreed to this and they didn't.
There are certain nuances in that, because we maybe should not take too much satisfaction from it, because actually this kind of reference was there in one of the Heart of Asia conferences relating to Afghanistan.
Right.
So this is a reference to all the different groups which target Afghanistan. And of course, some of the India-related groups also target Afghanistan.
So this is America's greater involvement in Afghanistan. And
well, I mean,
reflecting
I think the BRICS has in fact taken up international terrorism as a major issue,
yes.
And the fact that the reference to these groups have been included in the declaration is a matter of satisfaction for India. Let us not belittle
yes.
the importance of that. But as I said, I do not see Pakistan actually responding to this by changing its behavior. Right. As you know, if you look at the reaction of Pakistan to the summit declaration, is that this is not in fact a appropriate
right.
declaration, and it should not be targeted against Pakistan.
You have worked on this area for decades. When we're talking about normal relations between India and Pakistan, why do we need it? You want it so that India is lifted by its relationship with its neighbors,
yes.
Right? Yeah.
Because unless you manage your own periphery effectively,
yes.
it is very difficult to think in terms of any kind of a major role regionally or globally. So, right. Having a more normalized relationship with countries in the region, creating an environment where they look to you, right. Not as a threat but as an opportunity.
Right.
How do we?
So what, in the sense of the legacy of the past,
yes.
How do we have normal relations with Pakistan?
So one thing that we should have no illusion about, that some people have, that somehow or the other there can be a grand reconciliation between estranged brothers. I don't think that is going to happen. It is not going to happen because our historical narrative.
That's sad to hear, but
yes, but that is the reality.
And
that is the reality.
Work with that as the reality.
Exactly. So if the narratives are so different, why did partition take place? Why did the Kashmir war happen? What happened in 1965? What happened in 1971? What happened even more recently in Kargil? If you look at how we look upon these incidents in our relationship and how they look upon it, they are completely divergent.
So now be France and Germany.
It is very difficult to think of that, because at least France and Germany after the war in some sense have a more aligned view of what happened during the Second World War or even before that. That has not yet happened in India-Pakistan relations. So what is realistic possibility? Realistic possibility is how do you make the relations as normal as possible by trying to work on how we can perhaps change the very hostile calculus that exists in Islamabad. And secondly, are there assets which we can use in order to incrementally change the perceptions of India in Pakistan?
So what is to be done? Do we engage? Do we
I have no doubt that this pattern of dialogue disruption is not of much use.
Right.
Engagement with Pakistan must be there. Because it is only through
at the
engagement,
roots, at the foundation, rather than
engagement or dialogue cannot be leverage.
Right.
You can use dialogue as a platform where you exercise leverage, but talking and not talking is not leverage. It is an admission that I don't have any other levers.
So what other ways could we engage?
So there are ways in which you can perhaps increase the cost of hostile behavior on the part of Pakistan.
That's a deterrent.
Whether it is raising the issue of human rights violations in Balochistan, asserting much more strongly our claim on Gilgit and Baltistan, increasing our presence in Afghanistan. These are deterrent elements.
So you maintain those pressure points?
Yes, and even increase those pressure points.
But how do you engage?
At the same time, you must take advantage of the fact that we have major assets in terms of, for example, the opportunities that we offer for trade and economic relations between the two sides. The advantages that exist because of the strong cultural affinities between the two sides. Bollywood is a very important example. Or the fact that India being such a large and open market, if Pakistani authors want to come and launch their books in India, or if Pakistani cricketers want to pay in IPL, or if Pakistani actors and actresses want to come and work in Bollywood, I would say that we should open the doors wider rather than to narrow the...
This is much more important than dialogue and...
Well, it should go together with dialogue, because
so
dialogue, I think, maintaining...
dialogue, but engagement on the ground level must happen.
I believe that is important, because I do not believe that following this pattern of having a dialogue, then something happens and then we stop the dialogue, then we again return to it, that is not really a pattern of behavior which has yielded any result.
Right.
And I don't think that talking or not talking is actually any deterrent as far as Pakistan is concerned.
So that's a very important thing, because a lot of people don't want all this engagement to happen, but when anybody, an Indian, goes to Pakistan, warmly, people to people, warmly welcomed.
So we should take
taxi
advantage
drivers
of that.
don't take money from India. Oh, you're from India, we are great. But at the political level, that has failed. So you're saying engage at the people to people
because once the door is opened wider and wider, for anybody sitting in Islamabad to try and close the door will become that much more difficult.
Right.
And I think that is of advantage to us rather than disadvantage.
Right. So you're saying engage at a people-to-people level, that will even make it easier for the dialogue to be successful.
Yes, over a period of
happening.
time. I don't expect immediate results. As I said, this is a long haul. The adversarial relationship between the two countries is likely to be a reality for the foreseeable future. The challenge really is to see how we can manage that adversarial relationship so that we move over a period of time to more normal state-to-state relations, which is what you want.
And of course there is historically, and is always the case, that it's good politics to have an enemy, to be almost at war with. It's been used by many leaders around the world, including in India. And we have an election coming and they have an election coming.
Well, I would say that, if you look at the interests of India in a very narrow frame, perhaps you are right.
Right.
But I think
Winning
if you look at India...
Winning elections in a narrow frame, that's the most
important. It is not necessary that elections can be won only on the basis of displaying hostility to a neighbor. But don't forget that when Nawaz Sharif was engaged in an election campaign, India was hardly mentioned.
Yeah.
There are many other issues.
As you say, if there's already a lot of people-to-people contact and there's a lot of exchange and trade, that will make it even more difficult
it makes it difficult to
manipulate
reverse that process.
So
and we should make it as difficult for the
Yeah.
other side to reverse that process.
Finally, the title of this wonderful book, I must say, you worked hard for once in your life. How India Sees the World. How does India see the world? How has it changed? And how does the world see India? And how has that changed?
Well, certainly with regard to how India is seen in other capitals of the world, there has been a very major change.
Yes.
As we talked about with respect to, say, the nuclear deal, how that expanded India's diplomatic options, because the world started seeing India in a different light.
So one is our economy doing much better.
Economy doing better, the fact that
China.
we have a much more diversified relationship.
Right.
We are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we are members of BRICS, we are members of the trilateral between amongst India, China and Russia. We have a strong relationship with the United States of America. We have a strategic relationship with Japan. So if you look at the very diversified nature of India's relationships with the rest of the world, we have actually come a long way, and that's something to be very encouraged about. But I would end by saying that one of the most attractive features of India is what we referred to earlier, the cosmopolitan kind of a spirit which India displays, the success that India has displayed in terms of managing diversity of a almost a unimaginable nature.
A wonderful example to the rest of India.
So the plurality of India and the success which India has achieved in a democratic framework, managing this plurality is one of the most attractive features to countries around the world.
And I love the way you link that internal diversity and plurality with the ability to handle the rest of the world and for the rest of the world to come into India.
It's very important. Yeah. This is a very precious asset that we have, which we should not undermine. Yeah.
Shyam, Saran, thank you very much once again. Brilliant as ever, and I learnt a lot.
Oh, thank you, Pranay, for having this conversation. I enjoyed it as much as I hope you did.
Now you have to get part 2. So much work.
First, you must write your book.
Oh, no, after seeing the amount of work, no chance. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.